Hey everybody in physiology land. This week we're going to be going over the nervous system. And so for this first video, I'm just going to concentrate on going over the organization of the nervous system and then some of the protections and some of the specific cells that are associated with it. So here we go. So on the first slide here, you see the way our nervous system is organized is between two different parts. You've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And notice that we sometimes just say for central nervous system, CNS, and peripheral nervous system, we say PNS. Okay. So our central nervous system is the nerve tissue that consists of our brain and our spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system then are all the nerves that branch off of the brain and the spinal cord. So if you took anatomy, you learned about the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. That was part of the peripheral nervous system, right? You may have learned about nerves that branched off the cervical area of the spinal cord, thoracic area, lumbar, sacral, right? That was all part of the peripheral system. So remember, the brain and spinal cord are part of your central nervous system. When we do go further into the peripheral nervous system, so again, these are nerve fibers, and they can do two things, these nerve fibers. You already learned about the action potentials that are produced down the axons. You learned about the synapses, and you learned about how that produces graded potentials at cell bodies. So we're going to put it all together now. So these nerve fibers carry information between the central nervous system and other parts of the body. So that's why that's called the periphery. Okay, it's on the side of the central nervous system. It's off to the side. So we can divide our peripheral nervous system into the afferent division. Okay, and the afferent division carries information from the periphery to your central nervous system. So that would be like your sensory area. You sense something on your fingers, you touch something, and that produces a signal up that sensory nerve or the afferent nerve to your central nervous system. And it can go to the brain or the spinal cord, or it might hit the spinal cord first on its way to the brain. Okay, and later on in later lectures, you're going to learn how the brain and the spinal cord then can process that information that it's receiving from the afferent division. And what I mean by processing, it's determining what it is, what we're touching, or what it's sensing, and what we're going to do about it. The what we're going to do about it comes in the efferent division. The efferent division then will be stimulated, nerves that are stimulated by the brain and or the spinal cord in order to produce a response. So efferent carries information away from the central nervous system and sends it to effector organs. You've heard that word before, to effector organs. Okay. So some of the examples we've seen already, we talked about homeostasis, and we talked about a sensor may be able to determine the blood pressure going through your blood vessels. Well, in this unit, we're going to learn that the way those sensors do it, the sensors are baroreceptors that are in specific areas in your blood vessel. So they're sensing the blood pressure. They're sending that blood pressure to the integrator, which we said was the hypothalamus. Well, that's in the brain. So that's your central nervous system. And then the hypothalamus determines maybe the blood pressure is too low. It's below the set point. So it's going to activate neurons that go to an effector organ like your heart. And in that case, it may stimulate your heart to beat faster, and that will bring up your blood pressure. Okay. Sorry, I'm just thinking about how much further I want to go with that. Okay. So the afferent division, you can think of that as the sensory, and the efferent division, you can think of that as motor responses. Okay. Let me see. what my next slide is. Yeah. So here's kind of putting all of that together. We just talked about your central nervous system has the brain and the spinal cord. The afferent division is the sensory, so it's bringing in sensory stimuli, and it could come from the periphery of your body, like I mentioned, touch from your skin. It could also come from your organs, like we just talked about, the pressure in your blood vessels. So again, that's a set of nerves. Then will stimulate either the brain or the spinal cord, or it could be both. We'll talk about that later and how that works. And then that's where that decision is being made about which set of efferent nerves to stimulate in order to produce a response. So in the efferent division, or sometimes we call it the motor division, okay, we have nerves that stimulate your skeletal muscles. So that's part of the somatic nervous system. Okay. Or we have a set of nerves, or we also have a set of nerves that stimulate your organs. Okay. And that's part of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system. Okay. One way to think of these two, when you control your skeletal muscles, that tends to be a voluntary movement. I'm deciding to move my hand like this and curl my fingers. Okay. The autonomic system, I think of the word automatic. Make sure you use the word autonomic though. Okay. In the autonomic system, this stimulates your organs. So this would stimulate the heart. I can't right now think about my heart beating faster. Okay, so this is an involuntary movement. Autonomic tends to be involuntary. That's why I call it automatic. This is also abbreviated as the ANS system. Okay. Within the autonomic system, what we're going to see late in a later lecture is that we can split that up into a sympathetic system and parasympathetic. These are, again, different sets of nerves that will sympathetic nervous system will stimulate organs that are necessary when you're in an excited state, what we call fight or flight. Okay. Parasympathetic nervous system are a subset of nerves that stimulate organs that should be more active when you're at rest. Okay. And so these two can work with one another, against one another. They usually produce opposite effects. Okay, but sometimes they might work simultaneously, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Right now, I just want you to know the organization. So here you can see those sets of nerves stimulate smooth muscle. There's a lot of smooth muscle associated with many organs in your body. Cardiac muscle, that's your heart. Exocrine glands, so that's things like your sweat glands, mammary glands, things like that. And some of your endocrine glands, those are glands that produce hormones. Okay, so these, your skeletal muscles and your organs, those are all considered effector organs. And then here we have this other subset called the enteric nervous system. We're just starting to learn more about this. This is a subset of nerves that are only associated with your digestive system. And so what we found is that your digestive system can have autonomous nerve stimulation. Okay, the autonomic nervous system can affect it. And in fact, the autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves that work on the digestive system as well. But we also have this autonomous set of nerves. And we'll discuss this more when we get to the digestive system, which is at the end of the semester. Okay. So again, just real quick in summary, we've got our central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. These are the integrators. Okay, it receives information via the afferent division, which is our sensory nerves. Okay, and we're going to learn in the next video about receptors that stimulate those sensory nerves. Okay, the brain and the spinal cord then make decisions and stimulate specific nerves through the efferent division in order to produce a response at the effector organ. If the response is from skeletal muscle to move, that's in the somatic nervous system. If the response are your organs, that's in the autonomic nervous system. If you're in a fight or flight state, nerves associated with the sympathetic division are activated. If we're in a rest state, rest and digest, we call it, we're in the parasympathetic nervous system. And then again, a different subset that we use in our digestive system, the enteric nervous system. We'll get to that later. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So within these systems, within the central and peripheral systems, we have functional classes of neurons. We've looked at this a little bit. So you looked at neurons already, and we looked at how action potentials are produced on the axon and what happens at the synapses, right? But now again, we're labeling these different cells. So the functional classes of cells, we have 3 of them that make up the nervous system. We have the afferent neurons, which again are sensory neurons. You have an interneuron. These are the neurons that are associated with the central nervous system. They're usually completely embedded within the central nervous system. Okay, you can see the pink area here is the central nervous system. And then the third type of neuron are efferent neurons, or the motor neuron. These are the neurons then that stimulate the effector organ and part of the peripheral nervous system. You'll see, though, that both afferent and efferent neurons, even though they're part of the peripheral system, there is a part that is associated with the central nervous system. Well, they have to if they're going to synapse with an interneuron. Okay, so be aware of this sequence of neurons. Afferent neurons always start with a sensory receptor. Again, we'll come back to that in the next video. If that sensory receptor can have a graded potential, if it's stimulated sufficiently, it'll produce an action potential down the axon. Okay, in afferent neurons, the cell body is usually off to the side here. Okay. Then the synapses occur within the central nervous system to an interneuron. We will see examples, though, where the afferent neuron can synapse directly to an efferent neuron. Okay, and so there won't be any need for the interneuron. But in this case, interneuron is in the CNS, synapses with our efferent or motor neuron, and that motor neuron will stretch all the way to an organ or a muscle or gland or something like that. Okay. Let's see. One thing I do want to mention about the interneuron is, again, I already mentioned it's found entirely within the CNS. And it always lies, if it's there, it lies between an afferent and an efferent neuron. And it's responsible for integrating afferent information and producing a response in the efferent neuron, and therefore the effector organ. And so again, what it is it's if it receives the appropriate signal coming from a receptor, then it will automatically stimulate the neuron here. But again, you can see the synapses between this afferent nerve to the cell body, so this will be a graded potential. So if it is a sufficient signal, if this graded potential is strong enough, then it will stimulate the efferent neuron it is attached to. That's the integration, or the quote unquote decision that it's making. Okay. Again, if this is at the sensory receptor, if that's stimulated sufficiently, then it will run an action potential here and will produce an EPSP. But only if there's enough EPSP strong enough occurring at the interneuron will the interneuron fire. Okay, and remember, you can have other inputs. Other things can converge onto this interneuron, which may be stimulating it or inhibiting it. Okay, so these are just the things that to think about as we go through this unit. Okay. All right. The central nervous system, I just threw this one in here. We'll talk about this when we get to the brain and the spinal cord. But so again, please remember that the spinal cord is part of the CNS. Many times people just think it's the brain, but the spinal cord is. It's just the other nerves that are just part of the PNS. Okay. This is, again, where the decisions are being made to help maintain homeostasis. And then your book will say it contains 10 to the 11th neurons or 100 billion neurons. But recent research actually shows that, within 10 years now, it shows that our brain and spinal cord consist of 80 billion neurons. That's a 20 billion neuron difference. And that's quite a big difference. That's like a baboon's brain, 20 billion neurons. So now that we know there's about 80, it kind of helps us understand the CNS a little bit better. But out of those 80 billion neurons, look at how many synapses you can have. About 100 trillion synapses, again, just within the central nervous system. And so that's all that convergence and divergence that we talked about before. So this is responsible for everything that we do, everything you can think of. Okay? All right. Next slide. So we've been talking about neurons. So those are the cells associated with nerve tissue, but there's another cell associated with them, and these are the glial cells. So hopefully this is a review of anatomy for you. So just remember that 90% of the CNS is composed of glial cells, but then we also have glial cells associated in our peripheral nervous system as well. So I do want you to be aware of each of these glial cells and what their functions are. Please refer to your textbook and also the Canvas for more information on that. I'll just go over very briefly. So the glial cells that are only found in the CNS are astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. Okay, so again, these are found in the CNS of our nerve tissue. Okay, these are also sometimes referred to as neuroglia instead of glial cells. Okay. So in general, our glial cells do not initiate or conduct the nerve impulses, but they do help communicate with neurons and each other via chemical signals. And so in the picture here, you can see many of the connections that are formed between glial cells and neurons and glial cells and even blood vessels and things like that. Okay. So again, in the CNS, we have astrocytes, and that's depicted by these green ones here. And they're named because they kind of look like a star. Early anatomists thought they looked like a star. Astro means star. These are the most abundant glial cells, and they're kind of mainly the glue of the CNS. They really hold neurons together. They guide neurons during fetal brain development, and they induce capillaries of the brain to undergo changes that help with the blood-brain barrier, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. They're also really important in helping to repair nerve tissue when there are brain injuries. So those are the astrocytes. We're learning too now that they play a role in neurotransmitter activity, and they can help take up ions like potassium from the ECF and just help to maintain that correct balance of potassium between the ECF and the ICF. Okay, and then they help enhance synapse formation and modify synaptic transmission. Let me skip down to oligodendrocytes. That's what you see here, kind of the purple. And notice they have these projections that wrap around the axons of neurons. So they form the myelin sheaths around the axons in the CNS. Okay. Next one are microglia. And the microglia are these are small cells here, micro meaning small, these guys. And these are the immune defense cells for the CNS. In a resting state, they can release low levels of growth factors that help neurons and other glial cells survive and thrive. But mainly think of them as immunity cells. And then the final one of the central nervous system are ependymal cells. And ependymal cells, you can see them here. And so ependymal cells, their job is to line the internal cavities within the brain. Remember, those are called the ventricles. And those ventricles are filled with fluid, and they help actually form that fluid located inside the ventricles. Remember, that fluid is referred to as cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Okay. For the peripheral nervous system, that's over here in this picture. There are only two types of glial cells. And one are the Schwann cells. So Schwann cells look like this. It's a cell that's completely wrapped around the axon, and that forms the myelin sheath in the peripheral system. So the myelin sheath around our nerves. And then the other one, they're not really showing here, are the satellite cells. And satellite cells are similar to microglia in that they have more of an immune function. Okay. So those are your glial cells. Okay, so the protection around the central nervous system, our brain and our spinal cord have several layers of protection because, again, this is the integrating center. This is a center that's kind of dictating or determining what we're experiencing and how we're going to react to that. Okay, so there's several layers of protection. And one, the bone, like the skull and the vertebrae. So a skull encases the brain, and the vertebral column surrounds the spinal cord. And then underneath that, the both the brain and the spinal cord are wrapped by three protective layers. Those are known as the meninges. So around the brain, they're called the cranial meninges, and around the spinal cord, they're called the spinal meninges. But each one consists of the thicker dura mater, then the arachnoid mater, where blood vessels travel through, and also the cerebral spinal fluid passes through that. And then the pia mater is a really thin layer that adheres right up against the tissue of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so again, this should be a review from anatomy. So please be sure you can look it up in our book as well. Make sure you understand the three protective and nourishing membranes of the CNS. Here's another picture where you can see the brain and the spinal cord, the ventricles along the inside where cerebral spinal fluid, that's another protection. The cerebral spinal fluid along the inside of the brain and the spinal cord, and then it also bathes around the outer portion within the arachnoid mater, and it kind of cushions our nerve tissue there. So if you hit your head, it's not a good thing. It does slosh around, but it doesn't hit up against the skull, which would really damage it because it's got the fluid that's cushioning in there. So it helps us somewhat. It's think of it as shock absorbing fluid to prevent the brain from really knocking up against that hard skull. Okay. In anatomy, you had to learn how the cerebral spinal fluid flowed throughout the spinal cord and brain. You don't have to learn that here. I just want you to know in general where it's found and what it does. And so the job of the cerebral spinal fluid, exchange of materials between neural cells and interstitial fluid surrounding the brain. All right, so all of the nutrients and things that are coming in comes in greatly through the cerebral spinal fluid. So that's where the exchange takes place. Cerebral spinal fluid can bathe all areas of our central nervous system tissue. Okay, and then it picks up the waste products. Okay. Let's see what else. I think that's all I'm going to say for that for now. I think you'll be fine with that for cerebral spinal fluid. Another protection of the brain is the blood-brain barrier. You may have heard of this. The blood-brain barrier protects the brain from any chemical fluctuations that occur in the blood. So remember, your blood is traveling throughout your entire system, and it's picking up different substances, not only nutrients and things like that, but hormones, and it could pick up toxins, it could pick up medications, things like that. And so we don't want those things to just leak into the tissues of the brain. So again, we have the blood-brain barrier here. And basically what it is our astrocytes help to form that. And what you're seeing here in the yellow, this is an example of a capillary in the brain. And the astrocytes, here's a cross section of the capillary. And what they do is they extend these projections, so they wrap over the capillaries, so that anything that would normally leak out of a capillary, the cells of the capillary, endothelial cells, and go into the interstitial fluid in the brain, it gets stopped by the astrocyte. And so it might enter the astrocyte, and then the astrocyte can determine if that's something that should be released to the brain tissue or not, and it may break it down. Okay, so it just minimizes the possibility that harmful bloodborne substances could reach the central nervous tissue, and it prevents certain circulating hormones that could act as neurotransmitters. You don't want that reaching the brain or reaching the brain. So, and then it also limits the use of drugs for treatment of the brain and spinal cord disorders, because there are many drugs that actually cannot pass through this blood-brain barrier. So again, another very important protection of the brain. Okay. And then just real quickly here, in the organization of the brain and the spinal cord, we have what we refer to as gray matter and white matter. And when you do a cross section of an actual brain and spinal cord, there are parts that look gray and there are parts that look white. And the reason is because it's the part of the neuron that's where it's accumulated in. So, for example, parts of the brain and the spinal cord are areas where the cell bodies are all accumulated together, and the cell bodies have a grayish look to them. And so we call that the gray matter. The axons, and especially when it has the myelin from the oligodendrocytes associated again in the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord, that myelination makes it look real shiny and white. And so we refer to that as the white matter. So white matter is usually where signals are being sent or received. Okay. And then the gray matter is the cell body where those signals are being integrated. Okay, so again, keep all of this in mind as we go through the specifics of the PNS and the CNS in the next videos. Okay, here's just what it looks like. Another picture in the spinal cord. Here's the middle. The gray matter looks like a butterfly. So again, those are the cell bodies, and their axons are projecting in the edges of the spinal cord. So remember, this is a cross section. So axons would be coming either toward us or away from us with their signals, and the cell bodies are within here. In the brain, it's the cerebrum mostly has the gray matter along the edges, and then the white matter in the central portion. Okay, and again, we'll talk more about this as we get into the details. Okay, and then here you can see what we call association fibers. These are just interneurons within the brain, and they're just synapsing with adjacent neurons or neurons in adjacent portions of the brain. So you might have a neuron from one gyrus, and it's stimulating the neuron in another gyrus. Okay, it could be going from the frontal lobe to the occipital lobe or vice versa. Laterally, it goes from the left side to the right side. Okay, and then through the white matter, it goes from the edges of the cerebrum down through the brainstem and down the spinal cord. Okay, so these are all different types of ways that neurons are connected to one another. Okay, that's all I'm going to do for now. The next video will cover the brain itself. Okay, thanks everybody.